Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, yes, that is Queen Victoria doing her tour around the park. And one more time around the park, and don't spare the horses, as she says. And it kind of felt like we were on that track for the federal election campaign. Welcome in. This is the Friday edition, the final edition of the Writ Race. And we're going to wrap things up here as far as the federal campaign is concerned. And we are joined, as usual, by John Wright and Keith Leslie. And I think, guys, one of the things that we begin to see settling after all of the numbers, and some of the numbers are still coming in where they're counting mail-in ballots, etc., is this overwhelming sense of discontent, Keith, that went with the result. And it's, for the one time in a long time, we got the result that we all expected but didn't want, right?
Well, pretty much. I mean, we sort of saw this going in. I mean, at first it looked like perhaps Trudeau and the Liberals could get their majority, but then it very quickly became apparent when he couldn't justify a reason, really a good reason for calling the election, that people didn't appreciate that. And so, his popularity fell and people took a good look at O'Toole. But in the end, we ended up with, essentially the same House. And some people are quite upset about that, but I don't think they should be, really. I mean, I know it's an expensive election and all that, and I'm not defending that aspect of it, but elections always matter. And we learned some things. I mean, we learned, for example, that Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada, despite drawing some really, impressive numbers at some rallies across the country, couldn't get a seat. That's good to know. I think that it was important to know because, let's face it, if the next election is in 2 years or even if it goes to 4 years, hopefully, by whatever the time span, COVID will be in the rearview mirror. What's he going to grasp onto then as some sort of populist issue that, fueled this campaign for him? And as we know, when the vaccine passports came in, that was really what, led to his quick rise in popularity during that election. So in the end, we got what we wanted. I think in the end, we had the same. We didn't need the election to get us where we are now, but we needed it to learn some things. We learned the Greens, still don't know where to run their leader. I mean, remember way back Elizabeth May ran against Peter MacKay in Nova Scotia. What was that about? And so there's the same thing with Anna May Paul running in Toronto Centre, where, you could run a 2x4 painted red and it would win for the Liberals. Mm-hmm. It just didn't seem to make sense. Anyway, we're a lot to digest there, but I think in the end, as you say, we got what we expected in the end. It may not please everybody, but at least the government can go forward now. There's no excuse not to, try and implement its post-recovery, post-COVID plans.
John, one of the things that became apparent, though, and the things that we learned is that probably Mr. O'Toole is not sending Mr. Bernier nor Mr. Kenney Christmas cards this year because as much and all as they may not have had a huge effect in terms of the polling, it seems evident, at least in out west, that there were some places where Bernier's party did take a significant enough chunk out of the Conservative vote that they lost seats in Alberta.
Yeah, it's evident that there's a whole bunch of places where the Conservatives, the hard right Conservatives and those who believe in the anti-vax, anti-masking, anti-passport things have a place to go to. I guess I reflect on this in a slightly different way. I think the Conservatives. Let me break it down in a different way. I think that when you go into an election, it is what you've said you're going to do, but when you're into the election, you then have a whole series of different criteria for both the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, and not so much on the NDP. Coming out of this election, they've said that they're standing for a series of things that they didn't before. They've actually had open debates with the NDP, and the NDP has pressured the Liberals to do certain things and to amend where they're going to. I think that there's the stand that they took on, trying to straddle on the vaccine is one thing, but you also recall that there were other pieces there that were not strong enough against the Prime Minister from Mr. O'Toole to come up to the stature of a lot of people in the West for his party as well. So, I don't think that the oil patch was addressed really, I don't think the alienation of the West was addressed. We do know that partially the gun issue was addressed. So I don't think it was all just, the PPC. It's a threat to his, the underlying core of what he could get in an election campaign. And I think, Dave, it's evident that there's about 25 seats in Ontario that were affected. But I think the platform as well has to be looked at. So I guess to Keith's point earlier, people got what they wanted in terms of the output of the seats. But I don't know how that translates into the throne speech of the Liberal government. I don't know how that translates now into where the government goes, because they have to now side with somebody like Jagmeet Singh in order for them to go forward. And by doing so, there's going to be a lot more policies put on the table. And Mr. O'Toole's going to have to rebrand the policy side, not just his own brand side.
So let me ask you this, because I think one of the things that sort of came up and was really quickly discussed, and I think it is the first point of discussion post-election, is what the hell is the Conservative Party then? I mean, if you really look at what they're doing, to win, they're going to have to be a different party. There's no question about it.
When O'Toole was saying it's not your dad's Conservative Party, he was very clearly saying it's not Stephen Harper's Conservative Party. We're not those scary guys who are afraid of right wing or afraid of social issues. We're just not those people. But the problem is most of his caucus and a lot of his candidates were those people. And they didn't appreciate him pulling out Brian Mulroney at one point in the campaign. They would rather have seen Stephen Harper brought out. At the same time, I think an awful lot of Canadians didn't think that Trudeau deserved, certainly not a majority, perhaps not even a victory. They looked at O'Toole, and I think it was, even though guns are not a big issue in Canada with most people, I think his inability to articulate why his platform said one thing on these guns and why he was saying another just said that, they weren't ready yet. So this is back to the point that the Conservatives have to, I don't know if it's rebrand or retool or whatever the word is going to be, but are they progressives again, like he tried to portray them? Because that didn't help them at all in the 905, so that's not going to make him at all an easy case for him to make with the Conservatives that are on the right side of this, that don't think they should go more to the center. He faces a tough road. I find it very interesting to see that Mike Harris came out and wrote a column saying, give O'Toole a chance. He compared it to his situation in 1990 when he was in third place. I think it was actually worse for Harris at the time. But he said, let O'Toole spend the next 18 months picking the best candidates he can, rebuilding the party, getting that policy platform together, getting that policy book in order. And I think that's what I think the majority of Conservatives realize needs to be done. You can't just keep chewing up new leaders like that. You have to give this one time. He overall increased the vote count. If he hadn't had Mad Max on the right, he probably would have won more seats. It would have been a much, much tighter race. Perhaps they could have got a minority themselves. So I think they need to give O'Toole time. But apparently not everyone in that party is willing to do that.
Well, it speaks to a level of immaturity to me, John. I mean, seriously speaking, when we get to this point, we talked a lot about the immaturity of the Green Party. To me, the Conservatives are almost in the same place. Aside from the fact that they managed to elect, a significant number of MPs, the point is, internally, they don't know what they are.
Yeah, but let me say three things. Number one is this really was a party that was created and fashioned by Stephen Harper because it came out of the Reform Party. So he basically owned the party when he had it. And O'Toole comes from a very different place. I mean, he's not in the West running, and having come from the Reform side, he's in the eastern part of the country, and he's got the Mulroney background and the center left kind of the progressive side of the party. So it's a different group of people within the party who he represents in many ways. Number two, I always find it interesting that the Conservatives get very hung up on being so explicit with the policies going on their platform and at these conventions when the majority of Conservatives probably know that it's going to kill them. I mean, they put things in their policy platform, and I know that, people could say, well, they're being transparent and you have to stand for principles and stuff like that. But the reality is that you're automatically handing the opposition a whole bunch of ammunition before you even step into the ring. And that's exactly what happened in this election campaign. And you can make sure that, your voice is heard after an election takes place. But again, I come back to those 7 words I always use for political parties, and that is, how's it working for you so far? Every time they do this, it ends up in the same result. Thirdly, I think that when you run a campaign like this, and you're a new leader with a new campaign team and a new slate of candidates, you've just been through the best thing for the next campaign. You've seen how it's rolled out and how you can chasten yourself or change things on the ground. You've seen the themes, you've seen the kind of ways in which this is likely to play out. You can have the fundraising and you can put together an experienced team now to move into the next part. I reflect for a moment on Jagmeet Singh. I mean, the NDP spent $25 million shepherding him around the country on, an airplane and lots of TikTok. And he's clearly the most popular of all of the people, but they didn't invest anything on the ground. Like they clearly, in almost every riding across the country, they ran candidates who really weren't all that great. They didn't have a get the vote out machinery that the others did. So I think on that part, you can be really well liked, but you can end up with nothing. Or you can be, respected, try again, but make sure that when you go the next time, you've learned your lesson and you can change up. And I think O'Toole needs to be able to do that in order to be successful.
Yeah, except we know that the knives are being sharpened already. We know that there are MPs right now who are ready to launch a campaign, whether it's explicitly or covertly, to undercut him. I mean, the conversation, Keith, over the last 4 days has just been whether or not Aaron O'Toole should keep his job, and so either they're going to have to rip the Band-Aid and say he's out, or they're going to have to put up and shut up and, to John's point, come up with this new look in terms of how they're going to approach the next campaign without laying rakes out in front of themselves.
Well, what exactly are these people who are wanting to toss Mr. O'Toole overboard? What are they pointing to that he did wrong in this campaign? I thought he did pretty well, given that the traps that were laid out in front of him. He overall increased their vote count. He painted a new picture of the party. I thought this non-scary side. I'm not your dad. So I thought that actually worked for him to some degree. I don't know what more people could have expected from him, other than having his candidates vaxxed. And you noticed Doug Ford, when he finally came out of the witness protection program this week, said, "Yeah, absolutely. I can't preach one thing and say another. Absolutely, all my candidates will be vaxxed." Completely. That's just the way it's going to be. And I think that really, really hurt Mr. O'Toole as well. But he did that why? Not for the general public. He did that for the candidates and the people in his own party. So the issue is from within. And I think they need to examine themselves and decide, as you say, what do they want to be? Do they want to be Reform Alliance conservatives? Do they want to be progressive conservatives? Do they want to be, not your dad's, but some new CPC party? What exactly does that stand for? What does it mean in this day and age? And they need to, talk to their own people about that. But I don't, at this point, for them to be looking at throwing Mr. O'Toole overboard so quickly, it just seems ludicrous. What exactly did he do wrong? I mean, he maybe did not represent what the core base of the party wanted him to do, but they also did want him to try and get out to that more moderate center to see if it would work. It didn't necessarily work this time, but I think it might work next time if they're more consistent and if they're more on side with the popular. If they had to know 80% of Canadians are vaccinated, you won't say your candidates are vaccinated. That's an issue.
There's lots of motives for calling on a leader after an election to resign. Especially when you haven't won and you don't have anything to offer, like a cabinet post or some bonus. I think that's the case here. I mean, Aaron O'Toole really doesn't have anything to offer, so he's wide open to others who might step in and say, well, you can be on my team and you'll get this or that. So, I mean, that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's always a faction after any leadership campaign who's going to stick with, the other side. Who didn't win. And those are the voices that you're probably hearing in the background who are saying, yeah, I knew it. The guy was never going to make it or break it. And, we should change it up as we should have at the convention. But I think the third thing is that he should embrace the challenge. I think he has to basically own this party. It has to come down to some display of review or vote or, however the mechanism works. he's going to have to go forward knowing that he's got ownership of whatever he's leading. And I think he's got to, look at it that way and not just issue some press coverage that says, we did what we did and my goodness, onwards and upwards. He's got to own this party and he's got to embrace that challenge in order to do so.
But he has to be embraced by the popular vote as well. I mean, and in very specific areas. So the point is, whatever he presents as a party leader and reframes the party, the bottom line, John, is he's got to win in Ontario.
Yeah, he does. And we've got some polling coming out tomorrow where I did examine whether the populace of the country believes that the leaders should resign or whether they should stay on to run in the next election. And the public is split on Mr. O'Toole, but a split is way bigger than the 37% that you need and the 32% that you got. So he's got support from the general population, as does Mr. Trudeau, who's kind of in the same boat. The only candidate that exceeds the two of them is Jagmeet Singh and also Blanchette in his own province. The only one that actually gets kicked to the curb is the Green Party leader, Anna May Paul. But, I mean, when you look at the numbers, he's got room to move within the population, and particularly in Ontario. It was just a campaign that ended up where he got skewered by a whole bunch of things that were in the platform and actually was late to the game on denouncing or changing his ways on the vaccination. I mean, that's kind of where I think that they messed up.
Do they have to? Does he have to somehow reach out and get back, appeal to those People Party people, the ones that moved over to Maxime Bernier during this election? Can they be brought back into a conservative tent by a leader that's intent on moving that tent to the center of the road? He wants to move that party much closer to the center. As Bill Davis used to say, in Ontario, the way you win, you get on the center line and you kick the other people off the road. You get the center. In Ontario, that's how and can he bring those People Party supporters into the conservative tent? And I think he really needs to bring as many of them back as possible to win seats.
Well, maybe, in the sense that what's fueling that party is the passport. And I was interested in how the Premier of Ontario addressed the issue when he talked about it the other day, because he never called it a passport. He called it a certificate. And he said, I was against it and it's only going to be temporary and we're going to see where it goes. So he left a whole bunch of doors open, but he didn't call it a passport, which is the symbol of what that party's all about. So I don't know how you get harder on the things that are fueling the other party. Secondly, even Maxime Bernier, following the election, said, look, if the other people are going to play dirty, I'm going to play dirty too, and I'm going to take on the media. I don't know whether you want to embrace anything to do with a party that's going to play that way. But Keith, I think that he's got to solidify Ontario. He's got to make sure that he's got that 905 area. And there were a couple of candidates there who espoused a, pretty hard line on what the PPC is espousing. But it's clear that he could have taken the 905 area, and he didn't. If you want to win, that's where you have to go. And if you extend yourself too far over to the right or into the PPC, you're not going to win it at all. Like, you might as well just give up right now.
So, what we have talked about here is this almost a move to being less ideological and more populist in his approach. And the guy that comes up, if you want the populist that can win Ontario, is Doug Ford. And his name came up rather loudly this week in terms of maybe the guy that can save the federal Conservatives, John.
Look, I think almost every premier of Ontario, can have some ambitions about leading some country forward federally. Even Mr. Davis, was pushed to the brink of leadership and stepped away from it at the last minute. So ambition is great, and usually the people around them are the ones that are going to push this. Mr. Ford has a legacy that he's built in Ontario that may serve him well for the next election campaign, but doesn't for the rest of the country. He can't speak French. I don't think he's going to be able to learn it very quickly. And if he doesn't, then you're basically saying, we don't need Quebec. Like, we're going to write it off and I'm going to win in the 905. I think there's a constituency that sees him as a populist leader in the province of Ontario, but not as a representative for the other parts of the country, because he comes from Ontario. I mean, you can't really speak for people who might vote for you in British Columbia who see you as a Ontario first kind of prime minister. So I think he's got more negatives, to even try than people are being honest about. But I think we're going to hear his name a lot. But I don't think at the end of the day he will step into the ring.
Although Keith, he has flirted with the idea, at least brought it up. So it's not as if it hasn't been top of mind, whether it's ambition or not. But John's right. I mean, the issue around just being able to speak French, I realize why we make such a big deal about that. But, that could be his handicap.
Absolutely, it would be the handicap. But I mean, that populism sometimes can play well in other parts of the country, surprisingly so. And he has been taking French lessons. We haven't seen him display very much evidence of it in a news conference situation, but he has been taking them. And if he actually did run federally or run for the leadership federally, he could try it out, and I suspect he would get some respect. Quebecers give a lot of respect to Anglophones who really make an attempt to learn French, especially later in life. And they don't appreciate the language being butchered, but they do appreciate attempts being made at it by someone like Doug Ford. So I think he could actually charm some people if he tried. I don't think he would. I think the people around him would say, your strength is right here in Ontario. Don't try and push it beyond that. Don't let your ego get in the way of a good thing. Concentrate on winning next year's election. But as John pointed out, lots of Ontario premiers have toyed with that idea just because they think, I can run the biggest or the most populous province in the country. These ideas can help the rest of the country, and it just doesn't work that way, especially with the rest of the country that very often doesn't like to be lectured to from Ontario.
Well, then let me ask you this, John, because if it's not about Doug Ford being the leader of the federal party, at what point does Doug Ford step up and say, we need Erin O'Toole to lead this country? It's my opportunity now over the next 2 to 4 years to endorse this guy, to actually create an environment where my people are comfortable with Erin O'Toole. He becomes the campaign manager for Erin O'Toole in the next election.
Well, successful politicians oftentimes don't lead other people's parades. They wait until the dust settles. And I think it's way too early for Mr. Ford to come out publicly. As I said, Erin O'Toole has to embrace the challenge. He's got to deal with the party. And I think Mr. Ford has to keep his powder dry for a while, all of that to fall out. I go to a different side, though, Keith, and I'd be interested in your view, because we talk about populism, but I don't think Mr. Ford is a populist anymore. I think he came into office, and I don't even know what the definition of populism is anymore. I mean, is it just rowdy people who are right-wing and want to do a whole bunch of things that maybe the rest don't? I don't know. But all I know is in the first year, I guess he carried that campaign into the Premier's office, and it went totally into the ditch. I mean, it only ended up at 23% support or whatever. And since he's come back the other way and governed kind of center in the province, he's now sitting at 42% approval rating, which is almost more than enough to get the government in the majority and going into the campaign that he wants. So I don't know how to define populism anymore, but I know that the last couple of years of Mr. Ford are not in the same way that he came to the office.
No, but he's a populist who knows when to be pragmatic, is the way I'm looking at it. He knows what's smart, what people want to hear. I don't think he at all believes in the idea of vaccine certificates or passports. He makes that very, very clear. But he implemented one because he's been convinced it's the right thing to do. I think that's the kind of leader people will respect, whether you call it a populist or just pragmatic or just being smart at the right time. He rose to the occasion in many people's eyes when COVID hit. They had some major stumbles in long-term care and other issues for sure, absolutely, and he was late. He had to be dragged kicking and screaming to some measures. But overall, I think we know why he's at 42%, and it's because of the overall handling of the pandemic. So he's going to be able to work with that going forward next year. As for the people around Mr. O'Toole, can Doug Ford's people help him? Most of the people that ran this campaign around Mr. O'Toole were Patrick Brown supporters, were people that had worked with Patrick Brown when he ran for the Conservative leadership in Ontario. So that was an interesting thing. It wasn't the normal old, it was, some of the old Ottawa crew, but a lot of them were the people that Patrick Brown had brought in. And remember, he was considered the ultimate outsider in the Ontario party when he came in and won the leadership. So I thought that was very interesting. But the idea of getting Doug Ford's people more comfortable with Erin O'Toole, and I think absolutely he needs that sort of endorsement and that sort of build-up as Dave talked about, from Mr. Ford for Mr. O'Toole, if he is to become a real serious candidate in the next federal election, which is, as Mr. O'Toole keeps pointing out, could be within another 18 months.
Two points on that. First, I agree wholeheartedly with every point you made. So there you go. Second, though, I wonder who, if you win a minority, the Conservatives align with in order to form the government. I mean, does it mean that, the Premier has to deal with whoever's the Prime Minister, and he, came out and said as soon as possible, congratulations, we all have the same voters, i.e. we got to work together and all this sort of stuff. But if O'Toole had won the minority, what would he have done? Would he have embraced the Bloc? Because he's not going to go to the NDP. He's going to embrace the Bloc. So what an interesting circumstance where we would have had Blanchette, demanding things for the nation of Quebec on one side, maybe alienating other people in the country, and having the Liberals and the New Democrats on the other side. It just, again, you might get a ticket to go to the dance, but who are you going to partner with in order to get to the, under the mirrored ball in the middle of the floor? I think that would have been a tough choice.
Yeah.
So just before we go, the numbers, as we mentioned off the top, still being counted in some cases. There are some very close ridings and all contingent, it seems, on the mail-in ballots. There were over 800,000 mail-in ballots. So, and they are looking at a lot of judicial reviews and certain recounts, etc. But one place where I think it's a sore spot in terms of how it's going to show up on the dashboard is whether or not Spadina Fort York is going to show Liberal or Independent. And the Kevin Vuong story is still being litigated at this point. When last we spoke about it, the obvious issue was that he had been accused of sexual assault and formally charged. Today, that's barely part of the conversation, Keith. It now is, well, he wasn't forthcoming with the party when they vetted him. And there's all kinds of questions as to whether or not he was thoroughly vetted by the party. So for me, it only reinforced that we weaponized a sexual assault charge for the sake of a political advantage or disadvantage, depending on where you're looking at it. This whole story is a complete and utter mess, to the point where the Toronto Star now weighing in, demanding that he resign and we have a by-election.
What the heck is this? I mean, come on. The Liberal Party was well within its rights, and it felt was within its rights if he misled them and didn't disclose this, to say, first pause his campaign and then say, okay, he's not going to be sitting as a Liberal MP. If he wins, he's not a Liberal. That's their right to do that. I don't see anybody's right to take away, or anybody's ability to take away his right to sit as a member of Parliament that he just won as an independent. That's absolutely his right. And for a newspaper to call for this, the newspaper that raised the story 3 days before the campaign, this 2-3-year-old story, the details of which, as you say, raise an awful lot of eyebrows, and it leads many people to say, well, that's perhaps why the Crown withdrew these charges and there was no more to this. I don't know. I do not know all the details of this. I don't want to get into all the details of this, but I think, if the House of Commons feels that voters were misled, they could then investigate this independent MP. But for the call for his resignation at this point seems completely over the top, when all he apparently did wrong at this point in the game was not disclosed to the Liberal Party of Canada that he had faced these charges and that they were withdrawn by the Crown. But
we also don't know that. I mean, the Liberal Party itself has been very, very quiet on this issue. And it's been, a lot of people within his own, constituency, and even his campaign manager and Adam Vaughan, who basically denounced him. But yeah, you're right. The party hasn't said anything, and I think he's gone to ground for a few days just to see where all of this settles out. I think, Kevin's a good guy, and he's in what I've seen of him, because I've worked with him on the roundtable at News Talk 1010. I don't know him really personally, but I think he's fairly naive in all of the process. I think he's really, a young man who doesn't know what the brutality of politics can be about. So the question he really has to face at some point is not in the statement that he released this week, which I think really drew him in deeper to this issue and not, helping anything that he's dealing with. But can you manage to work with a constituency and, that all the people within that riding, after they've lost faith in you? If the stars come out and a whole bunch of people within the community, including your campaign manager, have come out against you, then you have to think whether or not, when you go to Ottawa and you're frozen out of the Liberal Party, whether that's going to be a comfortable thing to do. And so I think he probably is doing a good job of thinking it through, but he really has to figure out whether or not, when he makes those decisions, whether he's going to be effective or not. And I think that probably will play out over the next few days.
Well, and I think at some level, the decision ultimately, if he stays in his seat, I agree with you. It's going to be a very difficult time for him to be sitting as an independent. And I can't imagine the welcoming he might get if the Liberal Party decides to include him in the caucus. So it's not going to be easy either way for him. But the ultimate decision, John, will come back when there's an election in 18 months or 4 years, and people will decide whether or not, Kevin's the guy that they want to represent them. But I think all of this has come down to the idea that his biggest crime, and again, we have diminished the sexual assault allegation. His biggest crime is that he was not forthcoming to the party, or that it was news to the party. And again, we don't know what the vetting process was, how quickly it happened, whether or not they asked the right questions at the right time. We've heard John Moore on his radio show list through the 10 or 12 pages of the vetting questionnaire. It sounds fairly thorough. But to me, I take objection, I take offense at being able to display this story as a sexual assault story initially. And, you know what? It's not really about that. We're going to shuffle that right off the side of the desk. And now it's about process in vetting a party candidate. I just find that objectionable, Keith.
It is objectionable. It's exactly why women don't like to come forward and report these things. Right. Because this kind of nonsense happens, and all of a sudden the victim, the alleged victim, whatever word you want to use, the woman who had to come forward and felt she had a right to make a complaint, is just completely sidelined in this discussion.
Yeah.
Totally. I can't imagine the kind of frustration level that brings, but we do know it leads to other women not reporting.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to leave it there, and we are going to take a slight break. We'll wait for the Ontario legislature to come back. That's in about 10 days or so, and we'll get a sense of what the session's going to look like, because they did prorogue the session. It means we're going to have a throne speech, all that kind of fun stuff. And we'll get into that. But we will also sort of give you an idea of how we're going to proceed here, because it would seem there was an appetite for more than a weekly show. So we'll compare our calendars, and once we get all that settled, we'll let you know. But we're planning to do this a little bit more frequently than we have in the past. Probably not 7 days a week, but it's great to be in your inbox.
Thanks, Uncle Dave.
Back to be in your inbox, and those of you who have joined the show over the course of the campaign, we're glad to have you. So that'll do it. That's the Writ Race. He's Keith Leslie, John Wright. I'm Dave Trafford, and this is an Eye Contact podcast.